I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
When we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
Foundations of society are fragile. We must be the shepherds of our own civilization.
Anyone answers either yes or no without making necessary distinctions, both are not telling the truth. They're lying.
Father, we pray that your word will become a hammer that breaks rocks into pieces. That you will raise up in this nation pulpits and prophets that will call the nation back to repentance.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently, or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah initiative, conversation without compromise.
The way this started is you posted the article about 50% of Americans believe that the Bible should impact American law. And I inflammatorily responded by saying halfway there, and now we're here. So I'm
right.
Very curious to hear kind of what your exact concerns are with that and see where we agree, where we disagree.
I mean, I have multiple concerns with that. Both personal concerns and legal concerns. I mean, on a personal level, I'm not a Christian, right? And
right.
I don't think I'd be comfortable necessarily with, and not just me, like many people wouldn't be comfortable with laws being based on biblical laws or whatnot, just on a personal level. And then on a legal level, I don't think that would necessarily comply with the Establishment Clause and separation between state and religion, church and state. And I mean, other than the fact that I'm not a Christian and many people in society aren't Christians, I think there's specific laws in the Bible that they're not suitable for today. They are kind of brutal or whatnot. And I mean, there's different ways of discussing and kind of interpreting things, but that's an issue in itself. Is like, maybe you're a good, you have a good kind of modern way of looking at these things or whatnot, but then there's other people who are like, hey, let's take the worst laws that we can find and apply them today because that's what it says in the Bible.
Sure. So I guess trying to figure out where to sort of start with that, because I think there's some valid concerns there, of course. But I think the first thing I'd be interested to get your thoughts on is what, obviously any kind of law in it by nature is imposing some kind of morality. That you can't have law that comes out of like a worldview vacuum, right? It's going to come from somebody's idea. So what do you think the sort of standards of right and wrong should be that are imposed as law, and what should they not be?
I mean, I think the idea of a common law based on democratic process is a good way to find laws that are suitable for your time and place. So I do have some issues with common law in terms of laws that were in the past and they're still on the books and necessarily valid for today. But we have a process for dealing with that in terms of, people can challenge the laws if there's something from the past, especially if they don't seem to comply with the Constitution and our understanding of the Constitution. You can sue, the government or whatnot, and you can try to change those laws. But I think that process, in terms of, democracy and having representation, and I mean, obviously, I have issues with and with our, the people in Congress to a large extent, of both parties, not just a single party. So that is an issue. That's an issue itself. But I think that the process overall is just a process. And I think that if we're able to fix our democratic institutions and democracy to a better extent, I mean, I think it comes down to that to a large extent, is are the people that are representing, actually representing? And if they are, then you should be comfortable with the laws that they're trying to push, and you should be able to work within the system to promote or certain laws that you want based on your interpretation, based on the interpretation of the majority, which has its issues as well. I'm not going to say majority rule doesn't, but it's better than just basing it on a book. And I think we need to have certain guidelines in place to protect minorities, and that should be something that's we do have some, but I think we still need more, so that the majority can't pass laws that hurt the minority. As long as we have that in place, then I'm all for a majority represent based on the process that we have right now, the Supreme Court and Congress.
So, but even then, right, you have this kind of growing number of people that want the Bible to be enforced as US law, right? You've got 50% there. So if you have 50% representation of people who want that, then the Bible influencing US law is somewhat inevitable under that system. Is it not?
Yeah, but as long as the Bible itself isn't as long as you're not referencing the Bible and citing the Bible to justify the law, I get it. Like, I get that people are going to push for laws that are based on their worldview and based on their values, and I might not agree with those laws, but I think the process is a process, and I also think that there's a lot of the 50% of the people, if you ask them, how about we punish adultery with make a capital punishment to cheat on your wife, the majority of them agree with that. So then you have to look into the interpretation and understanding of basing the laws on the Bible, and I think that's a very wide people have widely different opinions on that, some morals or the ethics of the Bible or whatnot, and some people, they might want to go back into Old Testament laws from Leviticus or something and want to apply all that.
Yeah. So his where I would,
but I don't think that's the majority, so that doesn't worry me as much as maybe laws.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things when dealing with this, right? So you're right. People who want to kind of enforce Levitical laws on society they exist, but it's mostly kind of cults rather than most Christians.
Right.
And so what I would advocate for would be, I think one of the first principles is that if you look at the sort of general narrative of the Bible, just on a surface level reading of it, there is a shift on how things are put together. That you go from a state and an established nation to something that's not based in an established nation. And that there's no militaristic nature of Jesus's ministry is a pretty big deal as far as reading the Bible in trajectory and applying that. But there's kind of there's more to it than that as well. So you talked about the separation of church and state, for example, which is something that I would actually argue is an Old Testament principle. And the reason that we have that is fundamentally from the Bible itself. It's not, separation of powers is not something that was imposed on Christians from non-Christians. It actually comes from the Bible itself. Right. Because in the Old Testament, you have a separation between the kings and the priests. And the kings are not allowed to do what the priests do, and the priests are not allowed to do what the kings do. And you have separate roles there. And then in the New Testament, you have the command from Jesus to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and render to God the things that are God's. So that doesn't mean we don't want just laws, but we don't want to live in, I guess what we don't want to live in is an ecclesiocracy, right? That religious leadership is the leadership of the state. We want a firm separation between those things.
So what's your understanding of basing the laws on, the Bible, or, what's your personal approach and understanding of this? Because so far I don't hear much difference, and I think part of it could be just what's the word I'm looking for, rhetorical.
Yeah, well, I think that probably there's lots of things we would agree on, right? But what's going to change is the foundations and some implications of that as well. So basically, if you take some of the more sort of brutal laws in the Old Testament, things like stoning for adultery, stoning for homosexuality, stoning for idolatry, etc., right? What you will see is those are firmly connected to this idea of having this earthly holy place in the temple, which isn't a thing in the New Testament, right? Israel is based on this idea of you have an earthly holy place, and it's all about keeping the unclean world out of that earthly holy place. So a lot of these stoning to death kind of commandments are to do with keeping the purity of the land from these unclean influences. Now, in the New Testament, those things are still sins, but the way we're operating is different, right? It's not that adultery is suddenly good. It's not that rebelling against parents is suddenly good, but that we're not looking for an earthly state to kind of impose that morality through the sword. So there's a parable in Matthew 13 where Jesus says the kingdom of God is like a farmer who sowed crops in a field, and then an enemy came and sowed weeds at night. And the servants say, look, there are weeds here. And they said, should we pluck them up and destroy them? And the master of the field says, no, let them both grow together till the end of the age and then separate them. So there's a very firm directive in Jesus's kingdom that it's not the job of the righteous to kill the wicked with like force, right? That's not the point. You just kind of like leave people to themselves and let God deal with people at the end. There's no earthly holy place to protect anymore, right? But as well as having these ceremonial laws that protect people's religion and the temple, there are some general equity principles that I would want to apply. So, for example, like how you deal with theft, for example, in the Bible, would be that it's ultimately about restoring what's taken from the victim. So if somebody steals something in America today, they go to jail, right? They steal my stuff, and then they get they get locked in a cell like an animal with a bunch of other people, and they usually come out as better educated criminals. And in the biblical view, the primary thing is restoration of the victim. So the punishment for theft in the Bible, for example, is you would have to restore fourfold what you have stolen. And then if you couldn't do that, then you'd have to work for that person for a fixed time until that's paid off. And so ultimately, you have a system that's about an objective idea of restoration and justice and punishment, rather than arbitrarily locking people up for no reasons. And so most crimes are dealt with through civil means, and other crimes are dealt with through corporal punishment. So things like murder, rape, enslaving somebody, right? Those would be capital crimes which would receive a death penalty. So I'd be in favor of a system which generally has much less kind of imprisonment of people, more sort of corporal punishment for severe crimes, and focused on sort of restoration. But I don't believe there's kind of a chapter you can read to go get this list of, okay, copy and paste from Leviticus and put it straight in the Constitution. I believe that there's wisdom and thought that needs to be put into applying something like that in the modern world. But I'm looking for the principles of justice and righteousness in God's word, and I want to find ways to apply those well in law.
I get it. No, I understand where you're coming from, but it sounds like it's kind of we pick and choose whatever we want to take, and I don't think that sounds that's a very well. I disagree with choosing anything necessarily, like saying okay, in the Bible's going to do it this way because we think it's probably the most wise way, but I mean, it doesn't sound like you guys are very just like if you actually believe that the Bible is a good source of law, good source of laws for everything, not just for certain things that you think is less. People aren't going to see you guys are crazy for trying to apply them.
Yeah, and I would push back on the idea that I'm trying to pick and choose arbitrarily, because even the Bible has an internal, even the Old Testament itself has an internal logic of how these things are applied, right? So if you take, say, the kosher dietary laws, there's no civil punishment for not doing those.
Right.
There's a difference between sins and crimes. So, for example, being drunk is a sin, but it's not a crime under the Bible's law. But whereas stealing would be a sin and a crime with a specific legal punishment to go with it. And so you have to, there's a differentiation between what is a sin and what is a crime. It has always been a theme of the Bible, and it's important for Christians to be able to do that. But it's not the same as kind of inconsistently saying, okay, well, I like this, but I don't like this. You've got to really wrestle with it, because we can always
write
laws which make it feel good.
Yeah, but I mean, you earlier you said that you wouldn't necessarily be for applying some of the capital punishment laws in the Bible, stoning people for adultery or for homosexuality or whatnot. But those are also they're not just sins; they're also the Bible considers them punishable crimes.
Yes, but as a reader of the Bible, right? Even on a surface level reading of it. Now, you may take some time to work out the sort of nitty gritty of the details here, but there is a trajectory where those are crimes in the Old Testament, and they're not punished as crimes in the New Testament, and there's no attempt to try and establish a way to punish those things as crimes. So
right, but the New Testament is, I mean, that's another issue, right? Is that the New Testament itself has never really been used as a source of law, because it doesn't contain, it doesn't contain any detailed legal, it's not. I've read the Bible several times, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and when you read the Old Testament, you get this sense that there's a religious law on it, right? In the New Testament, you have some of that, but it isn't fully built out. And a lot of this, what we're talking about, I feel it's like very theoretical and very personal or subjective according to the reader and according to what your school is, what your church is, or what your own opinions are, rather than what the Bible actually says or the New Testament. And the New Testament itself has never been used as a source of law in the first place. I mean, it's been used indirectly, but most of the laws that are in the New Testament, or the opinions, they're either based on something in the Old Testament, or they're rebuking something in the Old Testament, but it doesn't really have like legal framework, I don't feel, at least from my reading. And different churches might say differently. I know that some churches they try to build their own framework, but that's also an interpretation. It's not necessarily an objective interpretation or only correct one. And I think that's an issue. I mean, at least when you're talking about Jewish law or Islamic law, they're pretty built out, and they've actually been applied, especially Islamic law. It's been applied in the real world among many people. And I'm not arguing personally or applying Islamic law in the modern world myself anyways. I'm more, as I'm arguing with you right now, I'm more for secular laws in terms of application for people in general. But even just comparing Islam Islamic law with what Christianity, Islam has that whole kind of legal framework. But I feel like in Christianity, it's much more kind of a modern approach. The Catholic Church itself, it had certain laws and whatnot. That was papal law. It wasn't necessarily from the Bible, or the Pope would, interpret the Bible. Kind of what you're kind of approaching it yourself right now. It's like, okay, the Pope would read something from the Bible, and then they try to pass a law among, or the king of the area, as you said earlier. There was always this sense of separation between church and state in the Christianity. In terms of Old Testament, I might disagree a little bit with you in terms of like basing it on the Old Testament, because the way that was applied among Jews or whatnot in the Holy Land, it wasn't necessarily applied to non-Jews. But there's other laws applied to non-Jews, like killing them all in the Old Testament. So what I'm trying to say here is that because it's so subjective, and because it isn't really like laid out as a source of law, you can't really the issue becomes, this person, person will have different of what the Bible says, and that doesn't even make it a suitable source of law.
So while you say that, I'd actually argue that kind of everything you're advocating for, which you're calling secular law, has come to us out of the New Testament being applied to law. So let's take freedom of expression as one of them. The dissenting voices don't get squashed by the majority, right? That comes directly out of an appeal to the New Testament. Now, you've definitely had freedom of expression at various points in history, right? So even Tiberius Caesar says that in a free state, the heart and the mind and the tongue must also be free. And you've clearly got examples of that during Islamic history at times as well. So there's this really interesting book called The Apology of Al-Kindi, which is the first recorded dialogue between a Muslim and a Christian.
Right.
And
I've read it.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of that, he has full permission from the Khalifa to speak his mind without any consequences.
Right.
Because generally, freedom of expression is connected to the sort of power of the throne, right? And if the throne feels secure, then you're generally okay. And so So in the early Islamic societies, Christians and Jews and other minorities didn't really have any issue being able to say what they thought. Now, if you're a dissenting Muslim voice, it may be a little different, right? So if you're a traditionalist when the Mu'tazilites are reigning,
it also depends on what time. It also depends on the periods. I mean, different periods you had that, dissenting Islamic voices where they're allowed to dissent. In other periods, it's kind of similar. I think in general there was more freedom of speech for non-Muslim than Muslim sects, where there's a lot more of kind of the inter-Nicene type violence sometimes, or just just shutting them up because you don't want people to be misguided. But in different periods there was pretty open debate between different Islamic sects as well.
And so you kind of have this up and down in history, but right. At least in its precedent in sort of Western law really comes from John Milton and John Locke. And if you read both of their works, that John Locke's Letter Concerning Toleration is straight up an appeal to the life of Jesus. So he's saying that if Jesus himself does not use coercion or force to bring about obedience to the truth in anybody, how much more should we as his people not do that to others? And the advantage, then the reason he can make that argument is because, as you know, you can read the entirety of the life of Jesus in like an afternoon. And it's just
Right.
sort of self-evidently true that Jesus himself never uses coercion to get his point across. And so having a popular, accessible sort of standard of morality gives you the kind of grounding that you can make appeals to. Now, so yes, there's room for interpretation, but that room for interpretation is, it's limited, right? And so if let's take how the Bible's used in, say, Nazi Germany. So in Nazi Germany, Hitler makes some limited appeals to Christianity as well. But in order to do that, they have to kind of reinvent Christianity. They create something called positive Christianity, which removes the Old Testament, removes all references to Jesus being Jewish, and then sort of says, well, our best Aryan scholars have found out that Jesus was actually part of an Aryan village that was conquered by the Jews 100 years before he was born, and he was an Aryan who's there to fight the Jews, right? So you can't, from within the Bible itself, make the case for Nazism. You have to very, very selectively get parts of it to do that. And the same's true.
I mean, a lot of people have done that, though. There's a lot of, other than the Nazis, there's a lot of neo-Nazi, white nationalist type groups that are operating today, and they're growing, that are advocating for a white Christian American state that excludes everybody else. And I think that's a big danger, and it's very relevant today to just some of the people who are very close to the centers of power.
Yeah, and for sure those people exist, right? But ultimately, what you will see is that people have to read it very selectively, and ultimately will have to replace it with something. So generally, what you'll see in, say, white supremacist movements is that you'll move away from Christianity and move towards more sort of occultism and Odinism. Like, you're gonna see people reading the Bible as kind of a metaphor or a sort of allegory for something rather than the plain reading, because you cannot get away from how Judeo-centric the Bible is, right? There's like one mention of people who you could consider white people, which is a throwaway line to the Scythians, right? And that's it. So you kind of have to build your own version with it. And I'm very concerned about that. I am far more concerned about people manipulating and misusing the Bible than I am about Muslims or people from secular backgrounds or anything of the kind. I'm much more concerned about the misuse of the Bible itself, because it's a real issue.
Right. And I mean, I think that's the real risk in using the Bible or any book as a source of your law, is that you're going to get these type of groups, and sometimes they're powerful and have money and whatnot, and sometimes they operate in the shadows. So allowing them to get a foothold into the government, into our legal system, I think is very dangerous. And cutting off that opportunity and that doorway for theocracy, I think is very important. And the only way you can do that is by a separation of church and state.
So I guess when we talk about theocracy, right, neither of us are atheists, right?
No.
Right. So ultimately, rule by God is good.
Not necessarily. I mean, that's an area of interpretation, I think. Like, what is rule by God?
So, but on a fundamental sense, right?
And I personally believe that rule by God in yourself, not necessarily forcing or the rulers to like rule by God. Obviously, you want them to rule by morality, but I don't think morality is something that's is only the domain of religious people or people who believe in God. Even I mean, I've known and know lots of atheist people are very moral and more moral than some religious people that I know. So for me, the law and the application of law has to be based on I mean, saying that this kind of opens a bad world, that's based on morality. And that's what you want to look for in your leaders, in the people that you vote for, in the people that are legislating, and the people that are going to be in the courts. And then the difference there is obviously, what's morality? How do you define morality? Who's the arbiter of morality? What's it based on? But I think most people have a sense of right and wrong, and have a general sense of morality that it's pretty universal, I feel. I mean, there's obviously differences in certain things, but in general, you can, I mean, if somebody is corrupt, right, and they're going to use their position for corruption, that's something that nobody would differ on. That's not moral, whether you're atheist or not. And if somebody was to argue that it was, I mean, obviously you have this type of ideology of ultimate subjectivity that anything can be moral, but most people would differ with that. And I don't think most people, I mean, if they knew, and unfortunately, like, we're living these weird times today that we know that a lot of these people are corrupt, and people still vote for them. That's a big issue. But if you ask people who are voting, do you agree with corruption? They're going to say, no, I don't.
Well, I think the thing we're trying to avoid, right, is not so much, we're not trying to avoid God. We're trying to avoid people who claim to reign on God's behalf.
Right. I mean, yeah, obviously, if a person believes in God, that's not something like, especially for us, it's not, it's okay to vote for this guy because he believes in God. But it's the use of God and the use of religion. How does that person use God and use religion? And that's, I think, the biggest concern I personally have.
Yeah, and I would have the exact same concern that in any setting, right, that just on a personal level, if a Christian comes up to me and says, God told me to tell you this, then I'm immediately hesitant,
right?
Because at that point, you're making me make the decision that you're either a prophet or a false prophet.
Right, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's not really any middle ground, right? I'm not dealing with you as a person anymore. I'm either dealing with the best thing or the worst thing. And
right.
And so on a personal level, I don't want to see that at all. Even less so on a government level. Like, I think the idea of the divine right of kings is one of the worst possible ideas we could ever have.
Right. I mean, right now we have some people like in the South and in certain states. I think it was in Georgia, or was it Florida? There was a mayor who said that God told his wife to open up the city, like to break the lockdown. And I was just like, that's his source of law, was his understanding of, like, that him or was a prophet or something. That's very dangerous. Is just people can claim, that God told them to do something and they do it. I mean, that's even more dangerous, obviously, than saying I'm basing this on the Bible, because you're just basing it on your dreams or something, or yourself, and then expecting people to believe that you have some type of connection to God.
Right. And so, in my mind, the Bible, and I think internally, is not a stepping stone for people to kind of keep writing. That it puts some specific limits around what people should be able to do. So even in say the rules for, say, Israelite kings, you have a principle that a king must not acquire many horses and go and fight in foreign wars, that he shouldn't acquire many wives, he shouldn't acquire vast amounts of gold, and that he's to write out the law himself and read it every day of his life, so that his heart will not be exalted above that of his brothers. So a leader in the Bible is supposed to be somebody who, with a humble personal life, a humble financial life, who's not arrogant, does not take bribes, and is kind of under authority as well as being an authority. And the problem I think that we're both against is people who want to take religion as a license from God to rule by fiat, right? I do what I want because God is on my side.
I mean, but the problem is that's kind of unavoidable to a large extent. It's hard to avoid that happening. I mean, you might get one good leader, and the next one is exactly that type of person. And I think that's one of the big risks of basing your laws on, or your just of leadership on religion.
Well, I think you have that problem with anything, though, because if you look at, say, the French Revolution, or say sort of Marxism, that while you don't have a God, you have an established principle of revolution. You have a principle of the oppressed overthrowing the oppressor, and the definition of who that is keeps moving, so that you get past a group of people who legitimately, genuinely are oppressive, and then you start arresting random farmers. And so any ideology, any worldview is a tool for the people who want to use it nefariously.
Right. No, I agree with you that like any religion, any law is subject to interpretation, subject to misuse. I mean, to kind of circle back to the, I guess, core differences. I just feel it's an undemocratic process of saying, okay, I mean, what I'm trying to understand from you, I guess, is what's your understanding of how this would work in the real world, in America or circuit? I mean, what would change? How would that change? How would that work with the Constitution as we have it now? I'm trying to understand where you're coming from exactly in terms of because I agree with any source of law or power can be misused, but how do you understand using the Bible as a source of law in America?
Yeah, so I think first of all that I think the Constitution itself comes largely from Protestant tradition, not entirely, right? For sure, there's some secular enlightenment in there as well, but there is some Protestant Christian ethics very strongly woven into it from the beginning. So I don't have but the way I see transformation happening is I don't see, say, an overthrow of the U.S. government and then biblical law being imposed like an anvil on the rest of society, because that's not how God's kingdom spreads. It spreads through hearts and minds before it ever spreads into legal precedents, right? So what I'm concerned about is I don't this is my issue with how the whole country works right now, is that it's like we are kind of competing with each other to try and basically find some very powerful executive figure who can impose the will of the people we agree with on the people we disagree with. Like, I have literally zero interest in trying to coerce people who are not Christians to live like Christians. And I want to be entirely about persuasion, not about coercion. So the main thing I'm thinking about is that Christian ideas spread through people and through culture, and then eventually there does come a legal question, because if you believe that the Bible is the ultimate is the ultimate standard, God's word communicated to humanity, then ultimately just laws should conform to that in some sense. And the problem, if you don't have a good framework for it, you'll inevitably get a bad framework for it. So I think many of the problems in Western history have come from the point where Christians are not expecting to be in any power, then they get power, then they're terrible with it. So if you look at the first, say, 300 years of church history, you have Christianity being illegal for about 250 years. And then in the Edict of Milan, I believe, that Christianity is made legal in like 312. And I think in like 385 or something, it's made the official state religion. Now,
right,
so you're going from a persecuted underground group to the like official state religion in 80 years, and no one's prepared for that. So what do? You take down the eagles, you put up crosses, you paint crosses on all the legionary shields, you replace the pagan public prayers with the Christian public prayers, you replace the high priesthood with a Christian priesthood, and you get the papacy. And so that's and through that, by having a and sometimes by people doing good things, just not being prepared for the follow through. Like that's one stage of it, and then the big stage of it in Western Europe is under Gregory the Great, and truly a phenomenal leader. But he's the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope.
Right, the Gregorian calendar.
Yeah, but the reason, basically, the state government had collapsed. There's no one left to help people, and there's this huge refugee crisis because the Lombards are invading Italy. And this guy solves the refugee crisis by getting private money to fund and kind of coordinating people to look after each other, and basically fixes and feeds everyone. And at that point, right, there's no state government. This guy is really effective. Well, of course you want that kind of guy, right? I mean, if you can imagine somebody solving unemployment and solving poverty, like, you want that guy as your leader, but they don't think about the follow through. So you kind of get this singular powerful church in Europe that gains more and more power because you don't have a good framework of government. These things just tend to happen in a collapse. So my concern, right, is having a thorough Christian understanding that's based in the Bible and history, which is restrained and thoughtful, not reactionary.
Right, but the issue that, like, that's just one, that's your personal wish interpretation of it, and I just feel like it's just too possible for you to get back to the same exact situation we had before with blasphemy laws and killing people for being heretics. And what I'm saying, it's a slippery slope to a large degree, and extreme is something built to human beings to a large extent. I mean, it's very easy for people in societies to go extreme under the right or the wrong circumstances. And once you say, okay, this is a religious country based on Christianity or whatnot, maybe in the beginning or under certain leadership, you'll have a fair state, whatnot, that everybody's treated fine, and it's taking the good things. But it's easy to kind of fall into applying the worst of the Bible. I mean that's something that I see as differentiating, let's say, the Bible from like something like Marxism. Is like, it doesn't have, yes, this whole idea of revolution and whatnot it can lead to violence and whatnot, but it doesn't have all of the laws and whatnot in the Old Testament that people can say, oh, this is in the Bible, so we have to go chop off their heads and stone these people because they did this and that. And maybe in the beginning that's not how it'd be, but that's how it'll end. And that's why I think in the first the funders of the Constitution, they instituted, this strict separation of church and state. And you're right that there's certain things that were based on their understanding, Protestant understanding of religion. All then these are historical and cultural, they're products of their history and their culture. So obviously I'm not saying that that's not true, but they also, if you read letters or whatnot, you can also see that they're very concerned about, the Bible being used. The whole, the first, it's called, the Establishment Clause. That's the whole reason why it was put in the first place, is so that there won't be one religion above the other religions, because when that happens, then it can lead to much worse result. At the same time, you mentioned a few things so far that I didn't really respond to, but I just wanted to kind of bring up in terms of that the idea of freedom of speech is Bible, while at the same time the Bible or the Old Testament talks about as blasphemy laws, and that people who worship other gods, they need to be killed. And then also you have you mentioned earlier about theft.
Yeah.
In terms of if the person doesn't have that same law that you're talking about, what do you do? What are you supposed to do according to the Bible if the person doesn't have anything?
They would be an indentured servant until they've paid it off.
Yeah, they'd be slave. They'd be taken as a slave until it's paid off. That's the problem, right? It's like, okay, the first part maybe makes a little bit of sense, and then you're like, okay, we'll do the second part. And then additionally, it's like, since this hasn't been used in modern times, and we don't even know how that'd be, so it's just testing, maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. While we have models, mentioned this in that, in that discussion on Facebook, in terms of we have other models that work, that are based on science and research and whatnot, that you can apply instead of testing something from, a book that's 2,000 years old or older than 2,000 years. You have different models from around the world that do have research that show that these laws work. It doesn't have to be just because, it says that in the Bible. I'll give you my perspective. I know I'm a little bit loose, but there's a debate within the Islamic tradition called, there's a theory called Maqasidism, or it literally translates to objectivism, but obviously that has a different meaning in the Western philosophical sense. But it's okay, are these laws that are in the law for themselves, or are they for an actual objective? And I'm on religious laws, the way that they're formulated, whether they're in the Quran or even in the Bible. This law, even though it's taken from the context of the Quran and Islamic law, I think it's a good framework and a good way of understand. If a person believes in God, or they believe in religion, whether it's Islam, Christianity, or Judaism, or any other religion, it's a good way of trying to understand the religion. There's different schools of Maqasidism, but one is that, okay, these laws, they're not meant for themselves. They're meant to achieve certain objectives. So instead of saying, okay, we have to chop off this person, the Islamic traditions, in Sharia, if a person steals, they get their hand cut off, right? Instead of saying, let's do that. This what I'm saying right now is actually pretty controversial, even in the Islamic tradition. People, there'll be some mad people saying you're saying blasphemy or whatnot, but I'm going to say it. It's an actual opinion among some jurists, even that, and that was actually applied even during certain historical times, even by Omar, where he paused the whole idea of cutting people's hands off or whatnot for a certain period, because it wasn't achieving the objective that the law was there for, which is to minimize stealing. So when we want to create laws, whether it's secular laws, whether it's based on Christianity or whatnot, I think, for me, my personal perspective is that we should look at what we're trying to achieve. It shouldn't just based on punishing a person. I agree with you. A person should be for reform, right? What's the best and most humane way to reform the individual without, necessarily hurting them or whatnot? think we have rules for that, whether it's theft or any other area. I mean, when we talk about corporal punishment, which you mentioned, I think most people would agree that it's not a humane way of dealing with people, very inhumane, and it's in these religious books and whatnot. But maybe the reason that it's in there is that that's how it was done at the time and that's how it worked. But we don't necessarily have to use the most inhumane, method to get to the results that we want to achieve. And most of the research today actually shows that corporal punishment doesn't work. I mean, not necessarily on a legal basis, because there might be some research for that. I need to look into it more in terms of like countries actually use corporal punishment today. But in terms of even just raising your child, tons of research shows that corporal punishment actually makes the kid worse, makes it more likely that they're going to do things, but behind your back, so it becomes so much more secretive. I see that in societies that practice corporal punishment, like let's say Saudi Arabia, in terms of like legal law. I mean, a lot of the things that we're talking about, they still happen, and they happen to a larger extent, possibly even, except nobody knows about it because people are much more secretive. It doesn't really stop crimes from happening. But then you look at like other societies, like some of the Scandinavian countries that are very, the way that they deal with criminals tends to be very humane and very reform based, and rather than just punishment based. And they have excellent results. They have the lowest recidivism rates in the whole world. So that's my personal approach and understanding to these things.
Yeah. So when I'm so when we talk about, say, indentured servitude after theft, right? So I think it may be a different route when comparing it to Scandinavia, but there's still a prison system in Scandinavia. Now the sentences are lighter and the conditions are nicer, but it's still essentially slavery when you're in it. Like, you're still confined to a specific area. So and much more so in, say, the US prison system.
Right.
Right. So it's not a case of, it's not really a question of freedom or slavery in punishing crimes. It's a question of what kind of limitations are imposed on you in these settings, right? So
but there's a difference between putting somebody in a jail and having them become your personal indentured servant. And when they're your personal indentured servant or slave, the potential for abuse is much higher. I mean, even though our prisons are basically abusive systems anyways, but that's a problem with the American context, not necessarily the idea of jails, which I actually agree with you. I'm not a big fan of jails myself. I think we need to use them a lot less, but I also don't think that replacing that with corporal punishment or personal indentured servitude is a better approach.
So ultimately, the principles in the Bible are about, one, is about justice for the victim first and foremost, and then reform of the criminal on a secondary sense. So there's a very important question of proper restitution to the victim. So it's not, with what you're talking about, the objectivism sort of theory, that I think there's principles that you do have to wrestle from this, right? So maybe it doesn't necessarily need to look like, you have, you personally work for a person, but we have this in US civil court today. So I have a friend who works in loss prevention for a lot of major retail stores, and it's not a criminal issue, but in civil case, that you have the opportunity to be able to repay what you've stolen by a certain magnitude, and you have a certain amount of time to do it, right? So at that point, you just have debt to the person, which, according to the Bible, the borrower is a slave to the lender. So debt in itself is a form of slavery that's highly advised against biblically.
But
Right.
when these things have happened, that so ultimately, right? Yeah, sure, you can have abuses in a system where somebody specifically owes somebody else anything, right? Whether it's they owe them a day a week of work at their shop, whether they owe them $1,000, whether they owe them anything, right? Lender-borrower relationships are a hotbed for dangerous things to happen, right? And
Right.
whatever we can do to avoid those things happening is good, right? Any that's not something the Bible would be for. The Bible would, when you have indentured servants, they would have, you'd only own what they produce. You don't own their bodies. You don't own their entire life. But abuses certainly happen in any system where there's borrowers and lenders and people owe anything. But ultimately, there's principles behind these things, which is what we're trying to extract from this.
So for you, it's more of a moral aspect rather than just the laws themselves. It's the morality that's behind it.
Yeah. And now morality definitely comes into laws. So for example, right, an Old Testament one and New Testament one that still affect our justice system today. The concept of innocent until proven guilty is a really important thing. That's a moral thing and a legal thing. That you can't prosecute somebody without the proper amount of lines of evidence to do so. And then the right to remain silent, that's actually a tradition taken from the trial of Jesus, where he doesn't answer his accusers. So that's a huge part of Western legal tradition, that you don't have to answer somebody who's prosecuting you.
Yeah, but I think a lot of these concepts, they're pretty universal in the sense that they're not just found in religious traditions. They're also found even before Judaism. Some of these things that we're talking about, they're found in different societies and different law systems. I mean, I think that some of the things that we're talking about, they're based just on, in the Western context. I mean, other than the Bible itself, we have, you have Roman law, you have Greeks. You actually have a lot of stuff taken from the Arabic system. The whole idea of the jury, it was taken from the Maghrebi country and Spain, which is based on the Maliki school of law. So what I'm trying to say is that doesn't prove or show that, okay, that's why we have to take these laws from with things that are found in it, or that the Bible is necessarily even the original source of these things, which, I mean, I think it's inconsequential anyways, even if it was. But you get where I'm going with this. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Bible is the source of the U.S. law. And even if it was, what is that? I mean, that doesn't mean that we have to use it now as a source of the U.S. law either.
Right. So I think, I wouldn't say, well, okay, because this is the past, right, this is what we should go to now. Because I'm now in my, I'm very much a proponent from learning good things from history and removing bad things from history, right? So we not like literally removing them so we don't think about them, that we learn not to repeat certain lessons from the past as well. So I'm not trying to get back to 1723 or anything. I'm trying to apply principles that we've learned that are in the Bible to the world around me, right? So taking like, say, the freedom of expression conversation, that's still something that's very important to me, right? To have freedom of expression, and not just for myself, but especially for people who I disagree with as well. That it's very easy to get away from freedom of expression. Time and time again, it's easy to do that, because if you believe that another group is a danger
to your way of life, and that them speaking too much can bring down your entire reality, then your own moral system necessitates that you stop people from talking. So, so often I think my concerns with like irreligious sort of worldviews and the way they play out is that typically all humans everywhere tend to drift towards the ends justify the means. That's why we have the voting patterns we have, right? That, okay, this is awful, this person sucks, but this other person sucks more, therefore I'm just going to kind of swallow my scruples and hold my nose and vote for this person that I don't like because, well, the other people are worse than we are, and we've got to do whatever we got to do to beat them.
Right.
And so if you're in a, like, there's plenty of people who would actively justify that kind of thinking of the ends justify the means, right? And the more power you get, the easier it is to keep justifying the ends you use to stay in power. Like, you know, if I think of Saudi Arabia, for example, I'm convinced that Mohammed bin Salman wants to do in his mind what he thinks is good. But when you start believing it's all in your ability to control things and control the world around you, you kind of lose that. So
do you really believe that rulers are trying to do what's best? I don't.
I try and give people the benefit of the doubt. Like, I think I generally believe most people are trying to rationalize themselves as a good guy. Like, I think it's a very rare moment of clarity that somebody is like realizes, okay, I suck, but I'm just going to keep doing this anyway. I'm not saying it never happens, but I think generally people find excuses, right? That they kind of, well, but this person over
right
here, this thing over here.
But I thought. No, I get what you're saying. I think people try to. A lot of these people, they try to justify what's best for them is best for everybody, and that's a big problem. So it's not coming from a real sincere. I mean, this is what I believe personally. It's not coming from a sincere place of concern. Like, hey, if this is good for me, then it's good for most people, or most people that I actually care about, which is people of my socioeconomic class and whatnot. I'm not saying most people think that way, but I think a lot of people in power, most power structures, they think that way. It becomes a self-sustaining type of application, and not just in like political system, even in in companies, things like that. I think to a large extent, a lot of people are motivated by self-protection, regardless of how that affects others. I mean, they might try to do that in a more humane way, but if it comes down to a lot of people will do whatever they can to stay in power, and that's a big issue. And I think that's a great thing about our political system, is that it somewhat manages that. So far, it's been pretty successful at doing that. I don't know about the next few years what's going to come, but in terms of keeping people from becoming dictators and taking over the system and not being able to be removed, I think that's a good thing. The other thing regarding that point, I know we're kind of off topic, but there's actually some studies that show that a lot of rulers and people in power, they're actually sociopaths. I mean, the level of sociopath in terms of like percentage wise is off the charts for like people in positions of power. And there's been a lot of research on that, just psychological research and whatnot. And, whether it's kind of the confluence of narcissism and sociopathy, it's very high among people. It helps people succeed. It helps them get ahead, but it's a big problem when it comes at the expense of everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, I'd entirely believe that, but I'd say even generally, even people who are sociopaths, they don't necessarily have a great deal of empathy for other people, but they still think that what they're doing is beneficial for people, right? They can still sell themselves on it, and maybe they kind of like live in a little less stress about it and can have an easier time doing it. But I think, say, it's easy to look at the world and say, if you're say the Saudi royal family, and look at somewhere like Libya and see like, well, see, if we weren't who we are, we'd be like this.
Right.
It's easy for all of us to do that. It's like, okay, yeah, well, I'm not the best person in the world, but at least I'm not blank.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Most people don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm a bad guy, I want to be a bad guy today. But they know they're bad and they still do it. So it doesn't matter what they think about themselves. I prefer to look at the actions and why they're doing the things that they're doing. Specific things, like nobody says I'm a bad guy, but they know that they're doing pretty bad stuff. Like just in terms of like corruption, which is a global phenomenon that we have a lot of here in the US now. That's very, blatant. There's no way to like justify that and say, oh, I'm doing something good. I mean, I get that there's certain way, the way that they try to justify it for other people is, oh, this is a win-win. We win and they win and it's good for everybody. But I personally believe that at their heart of hearts, they know that this is bad and they don't care. As long as they get the money from what they're doing or they benefit from it, they don't care how negative it affects everybody. And there's a lot of research that shows that, like, people have been pointed out, like, okay, this is bad. What you're doing is harming millions of people, and they still do it. So, I mean, I don't know how to like equate that with somebody who has any type of moral concern for other people, in terms of other people that's outside of their own, own circle of their friends and family and like people that are of their class.
Right, and that's it. Right, you've got a tribalistic morality. Right, you've got, okay, it's not like complete selfishness, but it's drawing a sort of circle around the people who are sort of really important and doing everything you can to advance the benefit of those people.
Right.
But, right, that's one of the challenges of why you have to find an ethical, you've got to have an ethical standard to say, no, that's not actually right. Because if you just want to take a straight up evolutionary objective look at that, then that's how things tend to thrive. That tends to be the natural state of the world. You look at human history as an observer and say, yes, this is the way the world is. We can either try and cut against the grain of that system, or we can embrace the system, be the best of that.
Yeah, that's where I definitely disagree in terms of us embracing the system and trying to thrive within it, or that the system that we have is one that humans have thrived upon. I don't think most humans have thrived throughout history or even today. I think most humans have lived very unfortunate, difficult, sad lives that they didn't necessarily have to live, but that were caused by the power structures that we have that put these people below. And I mean, we've just had an evolution of the way that the forms of the power structures and systems of oppression have looked in different ages. But we still, I mean, we essentially live to a large degree in a feudal, neo-feudal society where the people at the bottom scrape from, they work really hard to barely make it, and the people at the top are enjoying the fruits of everybody else's labor. I mean, in a large, I mean, you might have seen my posts and whatnot on the internet. I'm pretty, I'm very into a more socialist approach economically, and I don't think that the way that our economy is set up is the best way for human success. And I think that there's a lot of assumptions and lies that are told about our economy and our system that are just told to keep the people in power, and to keep everybody else down and poor and needy, because that's what helps the people on the top stay on top.
So, disagreement about like specifics of politics aside, right? I'm talking more about the driving impulse here. Because I'm not saying the system of world history is good, right? I'm saying that it's normal, right? And so ultimately, we've got a choice whether we're going to stick to normal, or we have some greater ideas to push towards, right?
Right.
And that's where the question comes, because I would say oppressed oppressor is not a new way of looking at the world. It's just repeating the same cycle ultimately, because find me an evil empire that hasn't at one point seen themselves as the oppressed victims at some point.
Right. No, I don't think the objective of I mean, since you're saying that press, obviously it's not just Marxism or these things that, like you said, throughout history, you've had the oppressed become the oppressor. That's kind of a human trait more than necessarily just a system, a trait of a certain system. But I don't agree with that either. I think that people label certain things oppression, and there's partial, I wouldn't call it oppression, I'd call it rebalancing, fixing the oppressions and the injustices that were created by the people that they're being oppressed. But that doesn't mean, by necessity, giving people power means taking power from other people, or making sure that people are that the wealth is distributed equally. By necessity, to a large extent, means that some people are going to have less wealth. But I'm not saying that those people have to become oppressed and that they have to be the bottom, be killed and put in jails or whatnot. But I do think that the nature, and even within Marxism itself, it doesn't necessarily call for these things. It says that these things will probably necessarily happen out of the nature, because when you're trying to take away certain things from people that have them, they're going to fight back, and that's where the oppression comes in. Is that these people are fighting you, so you fight them back, because you're trying to make things better for everybody. And I think that's probably true. I mean, most people, like, they're not going to be willing to share. Some people are. Some people are very good about that, but most people they don't want to. They don't want to go be brought down a notch, and they're going to call that oppression, but I don't agree that it is.
So I think within the framework of this, right, it comes down to the central idea of, what people are by their nature and how you actually push against that nature. Because so, and what you use to push against that nature as well, right? So you and I would both look at a world where we see some broken things in it and want to push forward the world in a way that doesn't just benefit our immediate family and tribe, that should benefit a wider group of people.
Right.
But I don't think that's definitely certainly not the natural pattern. And for both of us to be heading in that direction, there's something outside of us which is pushing us beyond ourselves. Like for me, right, I don't naturally have buckets of care for people, outside of my direct vicinity. I just don't. But the Bible pushes me to think more, right? And I'm not just saying that, okay, well, I hate this, I don't want to do this, but I'm going to do it because God told me to. But the Bible forces me to consider everybody made in the image and likeness of God, to see all human beings as inherently valuable, and to push beyond my own inherent selfishness and be concerned about other people, right? Whereas, so an Ayn Randian philosophy
Right.
and lots of other philosophies would see selfishness as an inherent virtue, or at least, even if not selfishness
Right.
itself, right? There's a limit to how far it goes. And Jesus
Right.
faces this when Jesus tells people to loving your neighbor is the greatest command after loving God. And then somebody says, okay, but who's my neighbor? And he tells a story about somebody, of a complete outsider, rescuing somebody who's Jewish, and say, well, who's the better neighbor to him? And pushes us to a world beyond that.
Right.
So ultimately, to have, just laws and to have a world that moves anywhere, we've got to have something outside of us that transcends us to push against the worst parts of our nature.
I mean, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that the assumption in the first part about people naturally being, oppressive and naturally wanting to, this whole idea, this Darwinian worldview, and I'm not your basic, just it's kind of a cultural thing that's happened in the West in recent, the last 100 or since the Enlightenment, basically.
Yeah.
But it's increased a lot more in recent years, that people are inherently selfish and competitive, and that everybody's trying to take from everybody else. I don't agree with that framing of humanity or people. I think people are naturally cooperative, and that the best aspects of human history and of humanity is that cooperative thing. I do think that people do have competition with them as well, but I think that our social and economic structures in the modern world, they're the part of the cause for the great amount of selfishness and competition that makes people, this whole atomized worldview of individualism, a very modern phenomenon to a large extent. Most societies throughout history were more cooperative societies. I mean, for the inner group, right? Not for everybody.
Right.
Necessarily. That's where we have to expand past that. There's always been this tribalism of my group, and the people outside of it, we're either going to go to war with them or we're just going to ignore them. But I do think that we can transcend that. We can go beyond that in the modern world to a more universal globalist. I mean, I'm not a nationalist either. I'm more of a global, humanitarian type person in terms of, I think we're a global brotherhood. And I mean, our religious, the Bible and the Quran, they talk about us all coming from Adam anyways. So I think that it's getting people to realize that we're all brothers and sisters. And then that's how we cooperate on that level. And I think to get to that, though, you have to move past the systems that we've created in the modern world.
So
and
I guess
people feel that, I'm outside of these other people.
So I guess my question about that is that we're talking about, being a globalist. I guess I want some clarity on what you mean by that, because like how would you feel if Donald Trump was the president of the world?
So you make it get into a political position. I mean, on politics, I don't believe in borders personally. I don't think that we need borders. There should be borders. A person born in America or in Europe has is any better than somebody born in India or the Middle East or Africa in terms of what they deserve in this life. And I think that the nation-state system that we have in the current world is very harmful to people on the bottom, whether here in the U.S. or, especially in third world countries. They're exploited people where we take their resources and little back to them, and we prop up these little dictators to rule them so that we could, continue to take advantage of these people. So no, I don't think that Donald Trump should be the president of the world. I don't think that would even work in any type of system. I mean, I get what you're trying to say in terms of like these, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but I know that people talk about, this new world order and, where you have everybody everybody under one government. I don't think that would work really, but I do think that we need to move towards a system of global cooperation, where people don't think, they don't deserve more because they have the luck of the draw of being born in a rich country. And then on a individual level of each countries, I mean, I do agree with certain supranational organizations, United Nations or whatnot, in terms of the concept of that. Maybe the application is not so great currently, but the idea that you have global accountability, a global type of system where countries can negotiate among each other and find ways to agree upon common values, like the Charter of Human Rights. That's something I definitely agree with, and I think it's a great thing. So I think the problem right now is just in terms of application, in terms of the power dynamics of you have the rich Western countries, they have all the power, and the rest of the world is still subjugated under the current system.
So I think that there's parts I agree with, parts I disagree with. So I am very pro nation states, but not in the sort of my nation against everyone else's nation kind of thing. So the idea of nation states largely comes from the Bible itself, because if you look at Israel, it's not defined by its king or its capital city. It's defined by its people, its borders, and its law, which is a defining by kind of common law, and a protectorate of a certain people is better than one man's empire. But God's promise to Abraham is that I'm going to make you a great nation, and through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And that a great nation is supposed to be outward facing, right? So to this idea of, okay, we're going to be great by shutting off our borders, not welcoming foreigners, that's not how you make a great nation. The way you become a great nation is by being invested in the blessing of the whole world. So in my mind, borders are there not to stop the free flow of people. I'm pretty libertarian when it comes to people going where they want to go, but it's to stop the march of powerful groups across the world, right? To stop militaries, to stop the kingdoms and dominions of one people, and decentralize power as much as possible, not to build empires, right? And what the problem with the modern nation states is not that they're too much about nation states, it's because they become too imperial. They become too much about centralizing everything around this, the world revolves around us kind of mentality.
I agree with that. I'm anti-imperialist as well.
Yeah,
but the problem with your basing that on the Bible is the actual implications of that from the Bible are very bad, because the Jews were ordered to slaughter everybody in Palestine at the time. And that's kind of maybe part of where this idea of us against them, nation states, is coming from in the first place, is that, okay, we have to establish this state that's ethno-religious. I mean, maybe we took out the religious part right now to a large extent in many countries, but it's, the idea of modern nation states is based on ethnicity and language and a shared culture and whatnot. And a lot of it is actually pretty artificial, in the sense that a lot of the nation states that were established, they didn't have a national language or national ethnicity or whatnot. That was created over time. That was a big problem. I mean, like in France, before the establishment in France, there was a different language there. Every different region had its own dialect that was quite different from other areas of the country. So what happened when they established these modern nation states is you had to get everybody to follow. It has some advantages, obviously, at the time, that erased people's history, erased people's languages, their cultures. And that's a big problem. And I mean, that's going on until today in some places, where, if you're even in America, America, we have to some people like, oh, if you don't speak English, like some people can beat you up. It happens. Like, so I think that's part of where this comes from is this idea that you have to have a nation state based on certain shared characteristics. I agree with you that obviously you need to have security, and you need to have a way to fight back against imperial other countries. Like what I'm saying right now isn't necessarily 100% possible to apply in the current world in terms of like you'll get some rogue countries or whatnot that want to take you over or exploit you or whatnot. So that's a big issue. But to a large extent, that's the West doing that to the East, not other way around. And there are, I think that you need like the idea of borders is more in terms of like just security rather than immigration or whatnot. So I think we kind of agree on that. But the of the nation state itself in the way that's conceived in the modern world is something that I'm not for either. In that regards, I'm kind of I'm still kind of exploring my personal ideology in terms of the state and state power, because there's good things for it and there's some very bad things about it as well. Mm-hmm. And I think if you read into the literature on anarchy and anarchists, they make some really good points about not having a state in the first place. It's just the problems like how do you do that in the real world, or how do you apply that in a way that even if you had it yourself, other countries will come and take over. So during the Spanish Revolution, in the early 20th century, they actually had an anarchist state without a state, like without state power, without a government, right? And it worked pretty well. I mean, the people, they also saw themselves as the same. And the problem was then you had other foreign powers and the Spanish loyalists themselves. They came and kicked their asses. They're like, no, you guys, we don't want you to live like that. And if you're not organized to state or government, it's hard to fight back, unless it's like guerrilla warfare, militias and whatnot. And so I'm personally still kind of trying to navigate, because I mean, right now during the coronavirus, we see that when you have a strong state response, state institutions that can respond to these type of major things, you can't just rely on the free market. You have to rely on organized state involved in the problem. Because if you just rely on the free market, you're going to get things that we saw what happened earlier when this first started. Like we didn't have enough ventilators, we didn't have enough masks, all these type of issues, because the way our state has moved in the last, our country has moved in the last 40 years or so since the rise of neoliberalism. We've moved away from any type of state intervention towards like totally free market, which doesn't provide any back. If it's not making them money, then they're not going to do it. And that's a big problem when you have to deal with something on a national or global level. And you see that the countries that have dealt best with this, with this virus and the response have been the countries that have the strongest type of more socialist type states and the strongest type of state power involvement in that. So it's a double-edged sword, definitely.
Right. And just to clarify something, right? With the Israelites and say the extermination of the Canaanites, even in the text itself, it says, this is for these nations. You're not to do this when you go to war with the nations around you. So even if a modern, say, super Orthodox Israeli in the IDF, which isn't really a thing, it's not really the ultra Orthodox that are doing stuff, but let's just say they want to apply it that way, right? Let's say a settler, right, who's moving into the West Bank to set up a settlement, and they're using that to justify just wipe them all out. He's having to very, very selectively read that, and he couldn't use that as a justification if he read the full passage. It's just a specific...
But there's people who are actually doing that right now in Palestine.
Yeah, I know. And the reason that's such an issue is modern Orthodox Judaism isn't rooted in the text as it is rooted in these rooted in these vast arrays of traditions around them that basically prevent the text from speaking directly to things. And there's always these kind of
the Talmud.
Yeah. So there's always these rooms for interpretation, right? So whereas the text might say something quite on the nose and straightforward, and you see this in Western history, you see this in Islamic history. The text may something straightforward, but through these as endless sea of tradition, people find a way for it to kind of mean what they want it to mean.
Right, but I do see there's a lot of like texts in the Bible that are just kind of crazy. I mean, I don't mean to offend. I mean, it's the same thing. No. Whether if we look at Islamic texts or whatnot, there's things that are seen, held. But there's a lot of stuff that just doesn't make sense in terms of there's penalties for eating fat or eating blood or touching an animal or these type of things. And I get that, like, if they're personal laws that people just for themselves, that's fine. But it's just so easy to like fall into like trying to justify these things for other people, right? It's just like we can't do it, so you can't do it either. And I think Christians are more likely to do that than Jews, just because Jews aren't really into proselytizing and whatnot, while Christians and Muslims are more into kind of they want to convert everybody. So right. And I think that's a concern. But there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that's like it's hard to like even interpreting it in the best way or in context. They seem immoral and wrong and bad. And I get people do the same thing to the Quran, so I'm not gonna say everything is that way, but I mean, even the Quran, or let's say in the interpretation, the standard interpretations of the Quran, standard, like some of the standard Islamic legal laws, I don't agree with that necessarily, or the way that people understand. And that's why I wouldn't want to live under an Islamic state. But in some aspects, I mean, in many ways, I prefer to live under Islamic state than one that's based on the Judeo-Christian Bible.
So, but for you, right? So you look at some things in the Bible and some things in Islam, and you think, okay, not for me. I don't think there's ultimately good for the world. Like, what is right. the standard that you're kind of holding to? Like, is it just like an internal moral compass? Is it like a code written down somewhere else? Like, what is it that drives you to be? What is it that drives you to say yes, this, not this?
So to a certain extent, it's the idea of objectivism, to a large extent, actually. Mm-hmm. So for me, it's just what's going to get the best results with the most humane way of applying them. So I'm not like a legalist in that extent. Even though I've actually studied quite a bit within Islamic law and whatnot. I studied for years with scholars and all that type of stuff. But I've moved away from a legalistic understanding of the religion towards a more spiritual and moral understanding based on innate morality and the objectives of applying laws, and differentiating between personal laws and laws that are applied on the state level. So yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, it's personal. It's based on my own morality, but at the same time, it's also looking at what the results of the application of certain laws is. So if I feel like that law is going to be inhumane, or it's going to lead to worse results, or that there's ways to apply law that is more humane, then that's what I prefer. What was I going to say? Also science. So what I mean by science, obviously, is just research. You have different models that have been applied in different places in the world. Test other types of models on a small scale, and what works best, and that's the most objective way of doing it. What works best is what should be applied, and maybe something that works in one place doesn't necessarily work in another place, but you apply it, and if it doesn't work, you modify, you improve. So I'm very much a progressive in that regards as well. I don't believe in necessarily not on a moral aspect. Morally, I think I'm pretty strong, like set morals. Legal way, I'm very progressive. I don't think that we need to just apply laws that our forefathers applied, whether that's from a religious book or from just a common perspective. I think we have a lot of on the books that they're not based on the Bible or the Quran, but they're really bad and really wrong, and that need to be changed. But that's something that has to progress over time. So I'm very much against the conservative worldview and conservative approach to religion and law and society.
But I guess even with that, right, how you're defining progress is there's a standard there, right? That you're still saying, yeah, this is, you still have certain value inputs there that say, okay, freedom is better than oppression, right? Having everybody with enough to get by is better than having than a small group of rich people, but we get to space.
Right.
So either way, right, there's still a moral code which is guiding how you're defining progress itself.
I mean, I think it's essentially humanistic, not necessarily within the definition of humanism. You say maybe it's religious or spiritual humanism, right? Because a lot of humanism has to be atheistic or whatnot, but that's not a necessary part of it. It's just a common kind of understanding of humanism.
No, and it's certainly not the history.
But there is a religious humanist school. Yeah. So I'd agree with humanism to a large extent, with personal space for religion, or
and so that's and the
as long as it doesn't harm other people or affect other people.
Well, and I think that the humanism piece again there has to be a why behind that. So, have you ever read the Gallic Wars by Julius?
It's the Golden Rule. At the core, it's the Golden Rule. Sorry?
Have you ever read the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar?
No, I haven't.
So it's free on LibriVox, which is like free audiobooks, and it's
I know LibriVox. I love it.
No copyright on it.
Yeah. I use LibriVox a lot, actually. It's great.
So one thing that was most interesting about the Gallic Wars is how nonchalant Julius Caesar is about, and then we killed all the men and took all the women as slaves and burned their crops and that sort of stuff. Because the kind of classical morality he's operating on is this tribalistic morality, which doesn't see humanity as a whole. It sees, well, natural lords and natural slaves, which is just kind of inbuilt into the classical world. And so, again, I think anytime we're saying the world should not be that way, it should be look out for the little guy, we have got to give a why to that.
Right.
To be able to justify why we don't want to be there.
Right. I mean, I think that the why is that we're all humans, and there's not any essentially different between us. And it goes kind of back to the Golden Rule, whether you want to say that comes from religion or not. I think it's actually, I believe the Golden Rule is something that's innate within human beings. And most free society. I mean, understandings of it aren't necessarily always the same, and to a large extent, it's tribal as well. But I think it's just a universal application of the Golden Rule. I want everybody. I mean, I want to be treated the way I want everybody to treat other people like the way that they want to be treated. And once you look at it that way, you can apply all the that to, you can expand that to all these type of things that say, okay, if I don't want to be subjugated, then I don't want anybody else to be subjugated. If I don't want to be hungry, I don't want anybody else to be hungry. If I don't want to, I think that one right there, whether you want to say it's based on religion or based on innate morality, I think it's enough to, create a better world. And I think that a better economy and a better law based on that. Obviously, it's not that simple, but to a large extent, it's a good place to base your morality on. That's my why.
And ultimately, that is my hope of how the world changes. In that,
Right.
So I think what's unique about the example of Jesus, at least in the Christian framework, at least, right, is that we believe that he's God entered into humanity, right? And then laying down his life for people of all nations. So ultimately, right, that's the ultimate example in the Christian worldview of somebody who's powerful, wealthy, needs nothing from somebody, giving everything they have for the benefit of somebody. And that's supposed to be the example that we have in Christianity. We're not simply supposed to, because usually
it's example too.
Yeah. But usually the golden rule is that, if you don't want somebody to do something to you, don't do it to them. Which is good.
I think you could do it in the positive sense as well, though.
Yeah, Jesus is the positive sense. Like Jesus is the one where you find it in the positive sense, and he demonstrates that. So ultimately, the way that Christians should be living is not about building up their tribe and their people, but about seeing Jesus' example, who didn't count equality with God something to be grasped at all costs, but emptied himself and took on the form of a servant to bless other people. And that's ultimately what the Christian worldview is supposed to inspire in people: service of others, not empires, not domineering. And there's always going to be people who want to hide behind that and use religious language, but we've always got to be pushing against it.
Right. No, I agree with all of that. I think those are good morals and principles. And I think the problem with religion or with people, religious people, is this idea that we're different than anybody else. So we're better, or we have something that's better. Like, not necessarily thinking, I'm better, but we have a morality that is objectively better than everybody else's. And I don't think that's not necessarily true. I think religions are just they're just manifestations and communication of a lot of innate morality that people already have to a large extent. I mean, you're always going to have certain areas of difference of opinion. I mean, one thing that we didn't bring up, in this chat that I think is a very intense area is like abortions or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
But outside of those specific contentious areas, which I think a large degree of our polarization in society and whatnot is down to a few things. People agree on most things, like across cultures and across times. And, you see these states, and you see people in different times, they've gone against those morals. But, when you actually ask them what's right and wrong, most people would agree that. So I'm not just a totally subjective person when it comes to morality. I think it's innate. And that actually corresponds with the Islamic worldview more than it would with the Christian worldview, I'd say.
Well, I'd say you get it from both, because you got the fitra in the Islamic worldview, right? You have this innate morality,
right?
But you also have it in the book of Romans that everyone knows truth and suppresses that truth,
right? But I think the idea of being born in sin is something that I disagree with in terms of Christian worldview, both spiritually and also in terms of psychological effects on people.
Oh yeah, I completely agree that is a big difference, and I think it's a really important difference, and we should do another episode on that sometime.
Sounds good.
People born essentially good, because I actually think that the fitra is actually very similar to the essential assumptions of a progressive worldview in a lot of ways. And I think those go hand in hand together. And I think the Christian worldview would be not in line with that. And I think it's really interesting how it affects people and systems. So we should definitely have a conversation about it. But for now, we've gone for like 2 hours. So thank you for being here.
Definitely. Can I just wrap up one quick
thing?
Go ahead. So, I mean, just to kind of go back to the original topic that we're talking about, you know, a lot of the things that you were talking about, I agree with, but I agree with them from a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, you know, just to kind of reiterate the most important point that I believe that, like, why I wouldn't want the Christian worldviews. You see some of these groups that have a Christian worldview that want to implement it in society and in law and whatnot, and they don't correspond what you're saying necessarily. I mean, there's a lot of like extreme groups that are like right now, like the vice president, I personally believe like he's extreme and his group is from extreme. I don't know, you know, your take on it, and probably take too long for us to talk about it. But like, then you have like, have you heard of the family? They're basically like a cult, at least from my perspective. Have you heard about them?
Yeah, I'm immediately going to like Far Cry, but I've definitely heard of it.
The fellowship, what's it called? The family is the name of the documentary that was made about them. It's called, just one second, the Fellowship Foundation. There's a great documentary about them on Netflix that I highly, highly recommend watching. But I mean, it's scary stuff. And these people are trying to take over basically the country and force other people to live by a certain worldview and certain, you know, laws that don't necessarily correspond with what you're saying. I mean, I've read some stuff that some of their writers have written about whatnot, and some of them have published really big books. It's not, I'm going to create a theocracy in the negative sense, not in the positive way that you spun it, from my world, from my perspective. And I think, you know, you can say that, okay, you know, I want a system based on religion and whatnot, but it's going to seems like it's much sooner lead to what these guys are pushing than to what you're talking about. Though I have no problem with, you know, you proselytizing and trying to create people who believe in what you believe. That's everybody's right, and that's a good right to have in a society.
Yeah, and again, we'd share that concern, right? And if it makes you feel better, the goal is not to have a coup d'etat and say, okay, we're all officially Christian now, everyone else just suck it up. It's that you have a intentional, purposeful growth of the Christian worldview, and inevitably that makes its way to law, right? Inevitably, when people believe it, what people believe is truth and morality makes its way to law. And what I'm concerned about is doing that well and not doing it badly.
Right.
And so if Christianity grows, if more Christians get into government, typically what will happen, and they don't expect to do that and they're not ready for it, then we will get cultish behaviors. We will get people acting like they're speaking on God's behalf. And I'm dedicated to consistently applying the Bible in a way that pushes back against the excesses that can stand against the kind of crazies. And I'm far more concerned about doing that than I am about changing anyone else's mind. And that hopefully, you know, if we have a huge Christian majority in America in 70 years, that your great grandchildren or grandchildren aren't a persecuted minority in that, but are a loved minority who are taken care of. That failing, you guys can come hide in my basement.
Oh man, I mean, that wouldn't be too bad as long as it's not having us hide in your basement because of some crazies took over the government.
Yeah, and you know, offer stands if we get some non-Christian crazies as well, right?
Of course, every group has its crazies. Every group, I agree with that.
So yeah, and that's a big part of the Christian worldview is that I think is that everyone can learn from, is that Jesus says, first deal with a plank in your own eye before you deal with a speck in others' eyes, right?
Right.
And I think the world
Right.
functions as a much better place if we're concerned about dealing with our own crazies before we're trying to deal with the rest of the world.
Well, our own selves first, and then other people, and then the rest of the world, right?
Right.
Because that's the problem with a lot of religious people, is that they want to deal with everybody else, but they're not even looking at their own selves, and they're very, very flawed people a lot of times. Like, it's like if you spent, Bruce said, it was one of Sufis in his long history. He said, if I don't have time to look at other people's faults because I have so many faults. Like if you're busy with correcting your own faults, you don't have time to deal with other people's stuff. You don't even see it. Like you're trying to improve yourself, and then by improving yourself, you improve the people around you. That's just natural. But when you're trying to change the people around you, and you're not a good example, you're not a good person, then you're actually just gonna make things worse most of the time, and you're gonna make people hate you and your religion.
Yeah, and it just applies generally. Can you imagine the shift in politics that would happen if the first thing the Republicans or the Democrats did was they looked in the mirror and think, and each senator, right, starts the day thinking, what's wrong with me? And then what's wrong with my party? Then what's wrong with the country? And then what's wrong with the world, right? Instead, it's like, it's the world is the problem, then it's the Democrats, then it's the other people, then it's me, right?
So I think that, but at the same time, I disagree. And what I mean by that is, yes, I think it's very important for people to be to hold themselves accountable, but when we're looking at societal issues and societal problems, we have to recognize the structural issues behind them, because I think a big problem, and you see that a lot among these certain prosperity Christians and whatnot, who are just pushing this gospel of gospel of prosperity, that if you do this, you're gonna become rich, stuff. I think that's a very damaging ideology, not just on a religious perspective, but on a societal perspective. Not just regarding prosperity, just regarding dealing with the issues that we have in society. It's okay. This whole a lot of self-help genre and whatnot, they're like, yeah, you fix yourself, you get rich and everything. It's like, screw everybody else. But that's not the right way to deal with, like, dealing with poverty, for example. There's a great saying that, if charities needed, that means that you have something really wrong with your society if there's a big need for charity. Because if you actually address the root causes of poverty, you're not even going to need charity, because we have enough abundance and prosperity in this world and wealth that there shouldn't be any poverty in the first place, where we need this type of philanthropy and charity and whatnot. But it's about addressing the root causes. So while I do agree that people need to help themselves accountable, try to improve themselves, at the same time, and just say, improve yourself, and everything will get better. They might get better for you, but they're not going to get better for everybody else.
Well, the point isn't that you don't say anything to the world. It's that your starting point is your own issues, right? It's not that you don't try and address things, is that you do it from a stature of humility. But all those things that you mentioned, those are the perfect thing to talk about in the next thing, because it's a human nature issue, right?
Sounds good.
So let's do it. You ever up in Seattle?
I grew up in Seattle. Yeah.
You ever come here?
I was up there last summer.
Well, we should do an episode in person next time you're here.
Once all this is done, yeah, definitely. I'm not sure how soon that will be, but I was planning on trying to come this summer, but you see the circumstances around, not sure how that's gonna be. I miss Seattle, especially the summers in Seattle, man. They're perfect, so gorgeous.
I know. And you're in Arizona now, where you're literally
that's the worst place in the world.
It's literally hell in summer. So,
yeah. No, it's horrible here during summer. Horrible.
Okay, well, cool. Well, thanks again for doing this, and thank you guys for listening to the Al-Matti Initiative podcast.